We begin to form our own private community, wherein we then experience completeness in this new union. So I want you to begin to think about your relationship, your marriage as your own private community. All right, now that community exists to serve many needs. Okay, our need to be loved and our need to love, our need to be accepted and to be accepting, our need to be cherished, to be nourished, our need to belong, to be valued and appreciated, to be free to be ourselves without fear of ridicule or rejection, our need to feel safe and secure, to be able to reveal our deepest hopes, desires, dreams, and even our hurts, our need to be heard and to be listened to, as well as to listen, our need to be sexually satisfied, our need to feel significant and understood, to be supported, to give support as well as to receive it. And so even though God has provided the family community for these purposes, most of our families have failed to provide for us the kind of wholesome experience that enables us then, in turn, to provide for and establish our own private community where our needs are met and where we meet the needs of those living with us. Now, research indicates that 98% of us are from dysfunctional families. Well, what's a dysfunctional family? It's a family that is not functioning as God intended. For whatever reason, absentee father, absentee mother, parents who, even though they were present, could not or did not provide for us a loving and nurturing environment, and so on and so forth. Now, one reason our parents, that we have so many dysfunctioning families is because our parents themselves came from dysfunctioning families, and their parents before them, and their parents before them. In fact, the dysfunctional concept extends all the way back to the very first family, beginning with Adam and Eve. All right, Adam was off somewhere into his own thing. Eve wanted more out of life than she was getting. Cain felt the pressure of not being like his brother. All right, so we all experience those kinds of things. So the unfulfilling and often even debilitating families and marriages in which we live are the result of centuries and centuries of failing to function as God designed us to function. I want to read a quote to you by Dwight Small, who is the author of Your Marriage is God's Affair. And it goes like this: sexual sanctity can easily be soiled outside of marriage. It can also be shop-worn within marriage. The true nature and purpose of the sexual union can just as seriously be mismanaged inside of marriage as outside. Simply to keep sex for marriage is not sufficient to make it immune from tragedy and betrayal. Sex can be a sacrament or a sacrilege right within the marriage relation. It can be a hallowed thing or a hollow thing, a blessing or a burden. It is either a physical act from which there emerges a spiritual value, or it is a physical act and no more. Either it brings a deep sense of mutuality and oneness and love and trust, or it stands alone as a symbol of the ease with which two persons can exploit a pleasurable experience for purely selfish ends. I want you to keep that in mind as you evaluate your own private community, your own relationship, and determining as you answer that first set of alternatives in terms of describing the sexual relationship in your marriage, whether it is a sacrament or sacrilege. Is it hallowed or hollow? Is it a blessing or is it a burden? Okay, now we want to take a few minutes and just look at the second point in your outline concerning the condition of our marriages. And when I talk about condition, I want you to think in basically three ways: exceptions, expectations, and environment. In fact, four. You can add to that exposure. Okay. When God created Adam and Eve, he planted a garden toward the east in Eden, and there he placed the man and woman whom he formed, and the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. Okay. Now, when he placed them, the conditions okay, refers to the environment, as well as it refers to some expectations, as well as some exceptions. When he placed them in the garden, there were some stipulations, or at least one stipulation, and that was that they could not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil if they were going to be free as God intended. And so there were prohibitions, all right? So think of your own relationship in terms of any prohibitions or any stipulations, all right? There are certain things that they were allowed to do, and there were certain things that they were not allowed to do. All right, so we bring that into our relationships as well. We have stipulations, there are prohibitions, there are privileges, all right, that come along with being married. Second, there are expectations or requirements. God required them to be obedient. That's a spiritual requirement. He required them to subdue the earth. That's responsibilities or utilizing the intellect. They were required to rule over the animals, having to do with administration and vocation. They were required to be fruitful and multiply. That's sexual. They were required to cleave. That's relational or emotional. It pertains to affection and loyalty. As well as they were required to eat of the plants and fruit, which is physical. All right? So there was provision. The condition in which they lived, in that condition in which they lived, there was provision for meeting the needs of the total person. All right, so you want to begin to think about your own relationship in that respect as well. When it comes to environment, we're talking about the manner or state of being. God, in the environment in which He placed them, provided for all of their needs for safety, their physical needs, emotional needs, spiritual, and so on. Fourth point is that they were exposed. They were naked and not ashamed. They had naked bodies. They were naked physically. There was naked trust. There was naked acceptance. Naked truth, those are emotional. And they were naked spiritually. They were totally free to be themselves. All right, it was a perfect little community. But we know that sin changed all that. And once they sinned, they became ashamed. They covered themselves physically. They became ashamed of their sexuality. They covered themselves spiritually and trying to hide from God. And they covered themselves emotionally because of fear of rejection. And so as a result, then, we continue today to cover ourselves the same way. We hide who we are and what we are, not only from others, but also from ourselves. Okay. Okay, we all have needs. Again, the need for closeness. And a lot of us, we manifest that in a lot of ways. When we were children, the closeness that we desired, number one, is the same closeness which Adam craved, all right? And even though a lot of times we crave that closeness, we think about back, say, if we go back to our childhood or in the community of our father and our mother, okay, before we were married, coming out of that community, sometimes the closest that we craved was denied us. And since we were denied it in that relationship, very often we carry over those feelings of rejection and so on and so forth into our current relationship, so much so that even though we crave closeness, because we at some point are denied it then, we kind of settle for a painful kind of existence trying to live without that closeness. Now, when we were children, we expressed that in a lot of different ways. We grabbed onto our mother's apron strings, or we would hold on to her leg. I have one daughter who, when I would come in and be trying to prepare dinner, she just demanded attention from me, and she would just grab onto my leg as I dragged her around the kitchen, okay? She just demanded attention. She demanded the closeness, all right? Some of us, we might remember climbing into our father's lap under the newspaper, okay, to be close to him, or crawling into our parents' bed. We would do well in school because we felt significant. We received attention, or being on a basketball team. And some of us, just by being quiet, we received attention that way. Okay, so there are many nonverbal ways that we try to let those important people in our lives know that we both want and need attention. But all too often our attempts go unnoticed, or are minimized, or ignored altogether. So those experiences or lack of experiences have taught us to depend or not to depend on or trust in people to meet our needs for closeness, significance, acceptance, and love. Now in our adult lives, often we repress those needs, but time and time again they surface and resurface. And when they do, they remind us of the pain that we felt and feel when we expect acceptance or love, but we receive rejection. When we marry with certain conditions, some of them conscious and some of them unconscious. Most of us, if not all of us, married with the idea that in our husband or in our wife, we had found someone whom we could finally trust, who would trust us, who would love us unconditionally, or so we thought at the time, who accepted us, who made us feel significant, who made us feel whole. But as time passed, we came to realize through circumstances and various situations that the conditions brought into our relationships, both parties, more or less, demanded of us things which we were unable or unwilling to give. Now, the third basic concept is the concept of company or companionship. All right, it's said that man is an epitome of the world. That is, the kind of people we are individually determines the kind of world we live in. The person or the kind of person that I am significantly impacts my relationship and the condition of those relationships. Now, if you turn to chapter 5 in your manual, I think we'll come back to that one. We'll do the application at the end. So, all right, so I know you're all sitting there wondering, when is she going to get to the good part? Okay, what does all this have to do with sex, right? Turn over to the page that's where we talk about the reality of sexuality. Often when we think about our sexuality or sexual behavior, we view it or speak of it as somehow either separate from ourselves or separate from our other needs or separate from our overall human experience. And so that it's not uncommon to hear people say, well, we have a wonderful relationship, it's just that our sex life stinks, we'd be better off without it, why do we have to do this? Or you hear people say, well, I don't need sex, I can do without it, or he loves his body more than I do, what's the big deal, sex is okay, it's nice, I don't see why everybody makes such a big fuss about it. Okay, some of us have those kinds of attitudes. What we are doing with that kind of attitude, in effect, is that we isolate ourselves from ourselves, of course, which is impossible to do, which is why we experience so much dissonance, and we'll talk about dissonance in a minute. But we experience a lot of frustration because what we are doing is viewing our bodies as something that we have versus something that we are. All right, we are multidimensional beings. We've already said we're social, physical, intellectual, emotional, sexual, and spiritual. Okay, so it's important that we realize that we are sexual. God created us sexual beings, male and female, it says. He created them male and female. All right? Therefore, my sexuality is not something to be considered as separate from the other aspects of my being. Everything I do is related to the fact that I am a woman. There's not a minute in the day that I cease being a woman or that a man ceases to be a man. Everything, literally everything we do is related to our sexuality. All right? So God created them male and female. Okay? The fact that I am female is essentially who I am. The fact that you are male is essentially who you are. And we must view our sexuality not as something that we have, but as that which makes us who we are. Our body is more than something we have. It is what I am. This body is me. All right? My body is me just the same as my mind is me, just the same as my personality is me. And when we take the sexual dimension and we seek to isolate it from our total experience as a person, we by definition deprive ourselves of the wholeness which God created and designed us to experience. See, we dissect ourselves, which means to cut apart, to divide, or to cut in pieces. And because all the aspects of our being are intricately woven together, then it is impossible to affect one aspect of the person without also affecting every other aspect. So that we cannot refuse to relate to our mate's sexuality without affecting them emotionally. When we refuse them sexually, It is more than just a refusal of the physical act of sex. It is, in essence, a rejection of their body, which is in turn a rejection of them. By the same token, when we refuse to meet the emotional needs of our mate, it is a rejection of their sexuality and a rejection of their body. And it may simply mean that you love the physical act more than you love the person. So when we engage in the physical act of sex, it involves every aspect of our being. And therefore, you cannot touch me sexually without touching me emotionally, mentally, or psychologically, and spiritually. And you cannot refuse to touch me sexually without touching each of those aspects of my being. Okay. Now let's look at the point on sexuality misconstrued. When we try to separate ourselves that way, or we isolate ourselves, our sexuality, we experience dissonance, which manifests itself in a number of ways. Now, what is dissonance? Dissonance is what we experience when we have a set of beliefs, but our behavior does not demonstrate what we believe, or is contrary to what we believe. For example, I believe that I am a sexual being. I believe that I should express myself sexually, and that I need to relate to my mate sexually. Therefore, I don't have sex. Now, doesn't that make sense? I'll give you another example. I know I should communicate with my mate because if I do, my life won't be so difficult. I know I can communicate because I do it all the time, on my job, at church, and with other people. Therefore, I don't communicate with my mate. Does that make sense? No. All right, another one. I know I love my mate. I know that love is action. Therefore, I don't demonstrate love. It's confusing, isn't it? It's frustrating. That's dissonance. That's the dissonance that we feel when we believe something, but we fail to act on that belief. Sounds like a schizophrenic, right? Somebody with multiple personalities, right? Okay. This is dissonance. It is confusing and totally frustrating. And what dissonance does to our relationships is cause dissension, misunderstanding. It puts us at odds with each other. It causes us to fall out, to quarrel, to squabble, to be contentious, causes conflict, and therefore we have a split or a break in our relationships, and we are disunited instead of united. It's the Romans 7 phenomenon. We know what to do, we desire to do it, but we don't do it. That which we know we shouldn't do, we do. And that is what is destroying our relationships and our marriages. All right? We try to separate or isolate our sexualities from our total experience, and that manifests itself in a number of ways. The first way that we want to talk about is denial. We deny our sexuality. We do that by denying or repressing the need for expressing our sexuality through the physical act of sex. And therefore, our sexual energies are redirected towards other interests and activities, responsibilities. It results in a diminished sexual appetite. Men become preoccupied with themselves or their work. They're always busy, tired, no time, uncaring, unfeeling, non-emotional, logical, Lone Ranger syndrome, hostile. Women will throw themselves into their housework or their children, their career. We become depressed, emotionally unstable. We lose perspective on life. Okay? In fact, we've become so good at denial, we are so consistent at it, we're so committed and proficient at denial that not only do we deny our own sexuality, but we deny for our mates as well. Okay? We tell them, you don't need that. And he says, yes, I do. Or she says, yes, I do. And we say, no, you don't. All right? And sometimes we even make it into a spiritual issue. And we say, well, you're a man of God. Or you're a woman of God. And a lot of times if we're married to someone in ministry particularly, we just know that their commitment and love for the Lord will keep them. even when all others are falling. And we rationalize, well, I don't know about those other people, but I know that my husband fears God, or I know that he really loves me. And then if that doesn't work, we just fall back on, but if he doesn't, or if he, but he also knows that if he cheats on me, I will leave his behind. Right? Okay. And so we take each other for granted. And the danger with that is that we become vulnerable and predisposed to sexual temptation while we're in denial and while we're in isolation. We are not conscious or attending to our sexuality. So while we're saying or denying our sexuality by not relating to our mates, someone else will come along admitting their sexuality and reminding you about yours. And before you know it, okay, you begin to relate to this other person because they remind you of your sexuality. And that's why the Bible says that we are to be on guard, or that we are to guard our affections, that we are to be sober, to be vigilant, because our adversary walks around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. The opposite of denial is admission. So it's important that we admit what our needs are sexually. The second form that isolation takes is a misuse of sexuality. We'll use our sexuality, or we'll use sex as a relief for tension, to enhance our self-esteem, for assurance of love, to guard against the fear of rejection, or as a cure for loneliness. Now, all of these are byproducts or rewards of our sexual expression. But when we use sex in order to gain these, it is a misuse of our sexuality. That's why many of us stop engaging in the physical act. We thought that it, in and of itself, would give us self-esteem. It would make us feel good about ourselves. And at some point then, we no longer feel love, even though we were engaging in sex. Instead of guarding against the fear of rejection, we feel rejection when we engage in sex. And therefore, we avoid having sex. We have sex, but we still feel lonely. All right, that's the misuse of it. And the danger with that is we become disillusioned and despairing, okay? God said that this would do this for me, or so-and-so said this would do this for me, and it's not doing it. So we become disillusioned. And the third point under that is abuse, where we are overly attached